l'arrivée massive dans notre vie quotidienne des microprocesseurs, c'est-à-dire de tout petits ordinateurs par la taille, mais aux étonnantes possibilités, cette arrivée va modifier notre façon de vivre.
It may surprise you today that France was a pioneer in the early days of computing, but it is among the climate of innovation of the time that appeared Alice, a modest computer targeted to children. Let's explore the environment in which the little red machine was created and what you could do with it. In 2017, Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, visited the Touraine region of France to attend an auction at the prestigious Château d'Artigny. He went there to acquire something that was uniquely French. You would think it might be a piece of art, bottles of expensive wine, good cheese, or maybe a fancy dog. But it was something else completely. He bought a French computer from the 70s for $60,000 US. It was a rare find because not many units remain today. The machine that Paul Allen bought in France was a Micral N, and it is considered to be the first commercially available personal computer ever sold. The machine is now in the Living Computing Museum in Seattle.
Avant, l'informatique était réservée à des grandes entreprises et ça a descendu l'informatique dans la rue, tout simplement. Parce que c'était pas cher et facile à utiliser. Donc c'est une démocratisation totale de l'informatique que j'ai créée.
At home, personal computers were becoming more common since 1977, with the introduction of three heavy hitters: the Apple II, the TRS-80, and the Commodore B.A.T. But these machines were quite expensive, and it wasn't until the early 80s that computing and social media would become a staple of everyday life in France. Wait, social media? In the 80s? Yes, believe it or not, France had mainstream social media and basic online gaming 20 years before the internet became famous. There was a simple reason for this. At the end of the 70s, the French government realized that it could not compete with American and British computers.
Une France affaiblie serait une France qui recule dans la compétition des nations. Et lorsqu'on perd son rang, sait-on quand on le retrouvera?
So instead, it chose to focus on a slightly separate field. They will develop telematics. In other words, they will focus on communications and network computing.
Couplé aux télécommunications, il va maintenant être partout. Commence alors le règne de la télématique.
Bonjour, c'est moi, le Minitel. Qu'est-ce que je peux faire pour vous?
In 1981, sponsored by the government, the French telephone company introduced a little device called the Minitel. It was a tiny computer terminal that connected over the phone to more powerful servers, similar to how web browsers work today. This was the essence of Telematique. Users with simpler terminals connect to powerful central computers. And to benefit society, the services should be accessible to as many people as possible. To this end, the Minitel was distributed free of charge to anybody that had a phone line and wanted one. You could use it for free to access public services, such as the phone book or Yellow Pages. But the real money was in commercial offerings. Companies could partner with the phone operator to provide services per minute to Minitel users. These companies will make more money the longer their users stayed online. Quickly, all kinds of services appeared. It was very lucrative to provide chat rooms, private messaging, and even online games to the public. The games may have been limited and text-only, but to many people who never own a computer, this was completely new and alluring. The Minitel was a massive success. At its peak in 1994, the industry was making 1 billion euros per year, with 30% of French households being equipped with a terminal. But if you were a parent at the time, this pay-per-minute model of computing could quickly become very expensive. If you wanted your children to learn computing, something else would be needed. Minitels were produced by different companies, and one in particular was a company called Matra. Among other ventures, Matra had been selling the American TRS-80 computers in France since 1981. Seeing a demand from parents for affordable computing at home, the people at Matra had a simple but powerful idea. They would adapt a Tandy computer for French children and partner with Hachette, a major publishing company, to produce high-quality documentation. Alice was released in 1983 with a cover drawn by well-known French artist Moebius. It shipped with 2 different manuals, one covering the basic language for beginners and a second manual for assembly language. An upgraded model, the Alice 32, would release 1 year later with more RAM and a better video chip. Many models of computers were already available in France in the 80s, but most were too expensive for many families. So they would sell the Alice at a much lower price to make it as attractive as possible. Matra would advertise the system widely, placing ads in children's magazines and organizing competitions to give away a few units. Hachette owned some famous publications, such as the weekly Mickey's newspaper, and so they published a nice little booklet explaining computing while showcasing the Alice along the way. If we look at those ads, we can have an idea of what software to try today first, from the perspective of somebody that just discovered the system. It really feels like some of these editors were trying to convince parents. In a way saying, look, this is a machine where your kids can learn, and here are a bunch of programs that are educational. It definitely seems to be some of the programs that had more thought put into them. I would imagine that most of these games were shared between kids in the school recess. You would give your friend a tape, and your friend couldn't wait to get home to try the new game that they got. These kind of games were pretty easy to program if you had a listing, and at the time, you could buy several magazines, such as Hebdo, which was a weekly magazine that gave you listings. Even though the commercial games weren't that great, you could still have fun with the computer by typing in and playing with your own games.
Il faut apprendre l'informatique comme on apprend à écrire. C'est aussi simple, ou même plus simple.
And that's where the promise of the Alice actually paid off. Because if this system was all that you had, then you had a pretty strong motivation to explore and come up with your own creations. So from that perspective, I have to say that the Hachette Matra Alice did deliver what it promised. Matra released one final Alice model in 1985, the Alice 90. It had a few exclusive games, but did not sell very well. To be honest, I think that Matra, the parent company, did not really care about the computer market. And this, the Alice, was just using the resources. In other words, their links to publishing in Hachette and their partnership with Tandy to test the market and make a few bucks and see if it was profitable. Obviously, it was not. Things were not going well, but the death blow was when the French government decided to go with another company to supply schools in France with computers. At that point, Matra decided to abandon the market, and they've never done computers ever since.
On peut former tout le monde au savoir-faire, sans lequel ces appareils ne sont rien. Ces appareils, c'est du fer blanc. On les fera facilement, on les fera très bon marché. Tout le monde doit en avoir. Le problème, c'est de former les gens.
In the end, the Alice was only a passable system. It did not have the software nor the cloud to compete against other systems of the time. But does that mean that the system was a failure? The Alice was the first introduction to computers for many people, thanks to its clear manuals and code examples it provided. Many of those people ended up upgrading to more powerful machines and became programmers or game designers, or had a taste for computers ever since. The Alice was also an early platform for French company Infogrames, who would later become the modern Atari. So, the Alice, as modest as it was, did have its little contribution to computing history.
Ça me rappelle le bon vieux temps, mais c'était pas un temps toujours facile. Il fallait, parce que arriver à convaincre les gens qu'on avait raison.
What happened in France after the Alice disappeared, and how France lost prominence, and how Infogrames grew into wider things, is a story for another time.